Hi guys! In today's video we are going to talk about a lot of different animals. Not yet. We are going to be first looking at a situation. Let's take a look at this brown beetle and this green beetle. You can see that they are two very different colors. What do you think about each of these animals' survivability? Do you think they're going to be able to survive well, and would one survive more than the other? Well, in order to do that, we would have to think about their population size. Okay, that means going out and counting about how many beetles we have. And the other thing that we would need to know is who are the predators of these beetles, and what might attract a predator to one of these beetles over the other. If we look carefully, we can see that the green beetle stands out much more than the brown beetle, which would then cause there to be less numbers for the brown beetle. For the green beetle, and their population numbers would be less than the brown beetle. And so therefore, that would be considered, if there were an increase of the birds, that would be considered a limiting factor. A limiting factor is simply anything that limits a population's size. So let's go back to the first question I asked you. What do you think about the survivability of these two beetles? Well, in order to survive, they need to be able to, find food, water, shelter. That's their own survival. But to continue on with their population survival, they have to be able to find a mate and reproduce. So let's take a look and let's think about this situation a little bit more. If the birds are more attracted to the bright color of the green beetles, then the brown beetles' numbers are going to go up, which we can see in this chart. Because there was a variation in their color, the genetics of them, brown beetles are going to continue to have more brown beetles, and that's going to cause their population to continue to grow, because the green beetles, who when they mate are going to continue to have more green beetles, are going to continue to also attract the birds, and the birds are going to have more of a food source that's going to help with their survival. Because there's this variation, which then affects the reproduction of these animals who are passing these genes along to their animals, to their offspring, then that is showing kind of a shift or a limiting factor going on here. So let's take a look at this in an example situation. What I'm going to share with you actually comes from this book here that was written by Jane Goodall, who we have talked about this year. And in this book there is a chapter about different animals that have had extreme limiting factors affecting their population size. And it actually goes a step forward and it tells stories of how humans intervened and have helped to try to bring some of those population numbers back, which is a whole nother topic. But let's talk about our friend here. Now it's your turn. We're going to talk about the black-footed ferret. The black-footed ferret lives in the prairies of the United States, and at one time it had all of this space. However, by 1960, there were some very conservative estimations that they had 98% of this area wiped out. And they were down to just 2% of its habitat left because of development. That would be a limiting factor. Human development is often a limiting factor that affects different animal populations. But it wasn't just development that was a limiting factor for the black-footed ferret. With this development, ranchers were using the lands for their cattle. And also, there was another species in this area that was causing extra harm for the black-footed ferret, and that is prairie dogs. Prairie dogs also live in burrows like black-footed ferrets. However, prairie dogs are able to reproduce much quicker than the black-footed ferret, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But the ranchers were having or believing that they were having a lot of problems with their burrows. And so ranchers went out of their way to attempt to poison, kill, and do anything that they possibly could to keep prairie dog burrows to happen on their land so that nothing would happen to their cattle. And as a result of that, many of the black-footed ferrets were poisoned and killed. Let's take a look for a second at their population sizes. When you look at this chart, you can see that the United States government was actually considering them to be extinct way back in the year 1964. And there had been a few sightings of some in the early 70s, but as those populations were beginning to be monitored, they believed them to be truly extinct. It wasn't until 10 years later that a small population of them were found on a rancher's land in Montana, and they were studied. And they were trying to keep a close watch on their population numbers. And something drastic was happening. As you can see, this decrease in August of 1985, September, and October. Well, this is where the monitoring kind of kicked in, and they had some very heated discussions between the wildlife biologists that were monitoring them and the Fish and Game people in Montana who didn't believe that we needed to do a lot for this. And they agreed to be able to capture about 10 different black-footed ferrets, but they had to do it very slowly, and try to do a recovery program with them. The reason that, and this is one of the biggest limiting factors for our black-footed ferret, is if we think back to where they lived. Black-footed ferrets are actually a very solitary animal, and they don't like to live with tons of other animals in their burrows. And so they actually live really spread out away from the other black-footed ferrets. So when we go back to that survivability checklist, when we get to, find food, water, and shelter, but then to be able to continue the population on, they have to be able to find a mate and reproduce. Well, if all of these colonies are living really far apart from each other, it's harder for them to reproduce at the same rate than like the prairie dogs, who didn't have a problem in keeping their population numbers up during this time when they were being poisoned and their habitat was taken away from them. And so that was the biggest limiting factor for our black-footed ferret friends. However, through this reproduction program that they did, and they re-released black-footed ferrets back out into the wild, the population numbers are much more steady, and they are no longer on the brink of extinction. So, yay for the recovery of that animal. So there's a lot to consider with this story. We need to think back when we think about all of these ideas and think about our survivability checklist and how this all relates. So essentially, these black-footed ferrets were able to find food, water, and shelter. Piece of cake. But their genetic variation of them being solitary animals was one of their downfalls. And that led to them, when we think back to variation, leads to how that might affect reproduction. It made reproduction for these animals much more difficult, which then they were able and continued to pass that behavioral adaptation trait and gene to their offspring, which continued to allow them to be solitary, which then led for their numbers, population numbers, to be very low, to the point where twice in their lifetime the United States government thought that they were extinct. They were even considered to be one of North America's most rarest animals. And so to see them be able to come back and have their population numbers become healthy again is a great thing. But there's a lot of factors to consider, and we're going to continue to consider these factors in the next things that we talk about in class. So, I hope you enjoyed the story of our friend, the black-footed ferret, and we'll talk to you later.